Listen closely to what I'm about to tell you, because it doesn't fit inside ordinary logic, and I've stopped trying to make it fit. An 11-year-old boy once held the only piece of bread he'd seen in 2 days, and everyone who knew his story assumed he'd eat it himself. What he did with that bread instead is the reason I'm alive to tell you about it 30 years later. My name is Asha Dirie. I'm 61 years old now, and the boy in this story is my grandson Abdi, though he was mine to raise long before either of us understood what that would cost either of us. Before I get into it, tell me in the comments what town you're watching from, and write this: Jesus was there. We lived in a small, half-forgotten town called Millbrook, tucked into the hills outside Lewiston, Maine, where a lot of Somali families like ours had settled a generation back, looking for something steadier than what we'd left behind. In Millbrook, opportunity was as scarce as work at the old mill that had closed years before I ever got there. Families survived on what little there was, stretching every dollar and every bag of rice further than it wanted to go. Abdi had lived with me for 5 years by the time this story starts. His parents, my son Omar and his wife Zainab, had gone down to Boston chasing steady work, promising they'd send for him soon. Soon turned into months, months turned into years. The letters got shorter and further apart. The money stopped coming somewhere in the second year, and eventually it stopped altogether. I'd been a seamstress my whole working life. My hands had sewn wedding dresses, hemmed prayer garments, patched curtains for half the poorest houses in that town. But by the time this story starts, those hands had begun shaking without my permission. I couldn't thread a needle steady anymore, couldn't hold fabric taut the way the work demanded. Something in my body had started failing me. Slow at first, then faster than either of us wanted to admit. We lived in a small rented house with a roof that rattled every time it rained hard, walls thin enough that the winter wind found its way in through the cracks, no matter how many times we stuffed them with rags. We had one room, really, with a wood stove we almost never lit because the wood cost money we didn't have. Some nights, when the bills ran tight and dinner was rice with whatever we had on hand, I'd hum while I cooked anyway. And Abdi never once heard me complain about the buses I couldn't ride anymore or the sewing jobs that had dried up along with my steady hands. Abdi had left school 2 years before all this. Not because he didn't love it. He did. He used to come home reciting whatever the teacher had said about faraway places like it was scripture. But because somebody had to bring money into that house, and I couldn't do it anymore. So every morning before the sun cleared the ridge behind our house, that boy would put on his patched shirt, cinch a belt through pants that used to belong to an older cousin, and go looking for whatever work the day would give him. Some days Miss Loretta at the corner store let him haul boxes that weighed almost as much as he did, paid him a few dollars and a heel of stale bread. Other days he'd go out to the Pruitt family's land, picking stones out of the dirt before planting season. And if he was lucky, he'd come home with a couple dollars and a handful of cornmeal. Some days it was carrying water, sweeping yards, splitting wood, minding somebody's toddler while the mother worked a shift, whatever put even a little food on our table. The whole town knew our situation. Some people pitied us. Some people admired Abdi, quietly, the way you admire something you don't quite know how to help, and some people just looked away, because poverty makes folks uncomfortable, and it's easier to look past it than to carry any of its weight yourself. Miss Loretta sometimes handed him cold biscuits left over from the day before. Mr. Delroy at the mill occasionally gave him a scoop of flour when Abdi brought over the little cornmeal we managed to gather for grinding. Pastor Curtis Monroe, who ran the little church at the edge of town, always had a kind word for the boy, though the church itself was barely staying afloat and had little else to give. What nobody in Millbrook knew, what Abdi carried in the deepest part of himself without telling a soul, was this: every night before bed, he'd kneel beside my cot and pray in a low voice, the same prayers I'd taught him since he was small enough to sit in my lap. He'd ask God, in that child's voice that somehow carried a grown man's faith, to look after his grandmother. He'd remind God that he'd fed 5,000 people once with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he'd beg him for even a little food to get us through the next day. I'd smile at him through the tiredness, stroke his hair with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, and never say much. Just the smile, just the quiet gesture that told him, without a single word, that God hadn't abandoned us and never would. But my illness kept getting worse, day after day. I couldn't stand up from bed without help anymore, couldn't walk more than a few steps before my legs buckled under me. My appetite had all but vanished. When Abdi brought food home, I'd manage a bite or two before pushing the plate away gently, and we both knew I wasn't full. We just never said it out loud. One cold morning in March, the frost still heavy in the air, the first gray light barely touching the sky, Abdi woke up and knew, before he even looked at me, that something was different. My breathing had gone ragged, my chest rising and falling with a sound that scared him, like every breath was a fight I was losing. My forehead was slick with cold sweat, and when he touched my hand it was burning with fever. He tried to wake me gently. I opened my eyes, tried to smile at him, and it cost me more than a smile should ever cost. I whispered that I was fine, that I just needed a little more rest, but Abdi knew I wasn't fine. He could see it in my sunken eyes, feel it in my ragged breathing, in the way my whole body shook under the thin blanket. He promised himself that morning, without telling me, that he would not come home empty-handed that day, whatever it took. He put on his patched shirt, tied the laces on shoes that barely had soles left, and walked out into the cold with an empty stomach and a heart full of fear for me. He went door to door across Millbrook that day, knocked, asked, offered whatever work he could do. Luck wasn't with him. The Pruitts had nothing that day. Miss Loretta's shop was slow and couldn't afford him. The Fields had all the hands they needed, door after door, the same tired answers. The sun was high when he finally reached Miss Odessa's little bakery on the edge of town, a woman who lived alone and baked bread in a wood-fired oven to sell around the county. Abdi knocked with a hand that shook, not from fear, from hunger. He hadn't eaten since the day before. Miss Odessa came to the door, wiping flour from her hands onto a stained apron. She looked him over with that mix of pity and weariness people get when their own hearts are worn thin. She told him plainly it was a hard day for her. Too many orders, no help, no money to pay him. Abdi's heart sank for a moment, but he didn't give up. He told her, quiet but steady, that he didn't need money. He'd work for food, any food, a piece of bread, anything she could spare, because his grandmother was very sick and needed to eat something soon. Miss Odessa sighed long, glanced back into her kitchen at the loaves just coming out of the oven, golden and warm, and something in her shifted. She told him to come in, that if he helped her finish the batch, clean the oven, and sort the orders, she'd pay him with a whole loaf. Abdi's eyes lit up with a light they hadn't held all day. He agreed without hesitating and worked harder than he'd ever worked in his short life. He swept flour off the floor, kneaded the next batch of dough, hauled wood to keep the oven fed, organized loaves into baskets for different orders, scrubbed dishes until they shone, even helped 2 customers who came by to pick up their bread. 4 hours passed, maybe 5, before Miss Odessa, tired but pleased, handed him a large loaf, still warm from the oven. Abdi held that bread with both hands like he'd just been handed the biggest treasure in the world. He thanked her with wet eyes and walked out clutching it against his chest. Walking home down the dusty road, he told me later, he felt for the first time all day like things might be all right. His stomach was screaming at him. He hadn't eaten since the morning before, and the smell of that fresh bread was almost impossible to resist. A dangerous little thought crossed his mind, just one small bite, just a tiny one to quiet the hunger, and the rest would still go to his grandmother, whole. Nobody would even notice. But then he thought of my face that morning, pale, sweating, hollow-eyed, and he knew he could stand one more day of hunger. I needed every bit of that bread to have any chance of getting my strength back. He passed the little church on his way home, and without quite deciding to, he went in. He felt the pull to give thanks for the bread he'd earned. The church was empty and quiet, the evening light coming through the windows in soft patterns on the walls. Abdi walked to the front, knelt, and, in a near whisper, thanked God for that bread. He asked for me. He asked for strength to eat and get well, and he promised that tomorrow he'd work twice as hard. When he stepped back outside, the sun was low, painting the sky orange and deep red. The temperature was already dropping fast. Abdi picked up his pace, eager to get that bread into my hands. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, even if he'd had 100 years to guess, was that someone very particular had been watching every step he'd taken that whole day. When Abdi pushed open our door, the hinges groaning the way they always did, he found me exactly as he'd left me that morning, lying still, eyes closed, breathing hard. He came closer, carefully so as not to startle me, spoke softly near my ear, held the bread up with pride. I opened my eyes with real effort, and when I saw that loaf in my grandson's hands, my eyes filled with tears. I tried to smile at him, made a small gesture with my hand, telling him without words that he shouldn't have done it, that he should have eaten first. Abdi answered me with a firmness rare in a boy his age. That bread was for me. I needed strength to get well. He was fine. He could wait until tomorrow. He helped me sit up a little, tucked the blankets behind my back for comfort, tore off a piece of the bread and brought it carefully to my mouth. I managed 2 small bites before I had to turn my face away. Swallowing had become hard. My stomach wanted nothing. Abdi pushed gently, asked me to eat just a little more. Tears started forming in his eyes that he couldn't hold back. I took his hand in both of mine, hands shaking and cold as ice, and made a gesture asking him to eat something too. He understood without me saying it. I wasn't going to eat unless he ate as well. So he broke the loaf into 2 equal halves, one for each of us, and told me, almost whispering, that we'd eat together like family. I nodded weakly, and the 2 of us ate in silence, but Abdi noticed quickly that I was barely nibbling my piece, mostly just holding it, making small motions like I was eating without actually bringing it to my mouth. I was giving him the bigger share, pretending to eat, the way grandmothers do when they're determined to take care of their own until their very last breath. When we'd finished, or rather when Abdi had finished his half and I'd left most of mine untouched on my chest, I made a gesture asking him to come closer. He sat carefully on the edge of my cot. I took his face in both my hands and spoke very quietly, in a voice that no longer sounded quite like my own. I told him that if something happened to me, he should go live with Miss Loretta, that she'd take good care of him. I told him to keep being the good, hard-working boy he'd always been, and above everything, I told him to never lose his faith, that God never abandons the ones who trust him, even when everything seems lost for good. Abdi began crying without a sound. He begged me not to talk that way. He promised I'd be all right. He told me he needed me, that I was the only thing he had left in the world. I stroked his hair with my trembling hand, gave him the tired smile of a woman who has spent her whole life loving without asking for anything back, and told him, barely above a breath, that I needed him too, that he was the best thing that had ever happened to me, but that now he had to be strong, whatever came next. That night, I don't think Abdi slept at all. He stayed sitting beside my cot, watching my breathing, listening for anything that might mean he needed to help me. Sometime deep in that night, when the darkness was thickest and the silence most complete, he knelt beside me and prayed harder than he ever had in his short life. He asked God for me. He told him I was the only thing he had, that he didn't know what he'd do without me. He begged him to heal me, to give me strength to help me get better soon. He told God he was willing to do anything, that he'd work harder, find more food, do whatever was asked of him, but please, not to take me yet. And while he prayed in that cold, dark hour, Abdi told me he felt something strange settle over him, a peace he couldn't put into words, like a warm, loving presence had filled our small house, like somebody, without saying a single word, was telling him everything was going to be all right. When morning came, I still had fever, still weak as the day before, but my breathing seemed a little less labored. And when I opened my eyes and saw him sitting there beside me, I managed a small smile, gestured for him to go find work, told him I'd be fine while he was gone, not to worry about me. He didn't want to leave me alone. He was afraid of what he'd find when he came back. But he also knew we needed food, needed money for medicine. So he got up off the floor, washed his face with cold water from the pitcher, and before he left, he came back to my cot and promised me, his voice shaking, that he'd bring food home again that day too. He went out that morning under a clear sky, birds already singing in the bare trees, the town slowly waking up around him. He walked the streets, knocked door after door, offered whatever work he could think of. The answers were the same as always. Not today, maybe tomorrow? No work here? Try somewhere else. He'd covered almost the whole town when he noticed an older man sitting on the front step of what looked like an abandoned house on the edge of Millbrook, a man Abdi had never once seen around town before, which was strange because Millbrook was small enough that everybody knew everybody. The man wore plain, worn clothes. His hair was gray and windblown, his face weathered from sun, but there was something in his eyes, something deep and bright, that caught Abdi's attention immediately, something that seemed to look straight through a person, like he could see things nobody else could. When Abdi walked past him, the man called out softly, asked him to stop a moment. Abdi came closer cautiously. The man spoke to him like he'd known him his whole life, said he'd noticed him going door to door around town looking for work. Abdi nodded, explained briefly that his grandmother was very sick and he needed to find food urgently. The man nodded slowly, like the information didn't surprise him at all, like he already knew it. He told Abdi he could give him work, but he had no money to pay him. My grandson's heart sank a little, but he asked carefully what kind of food the man might be able to offer because he needed to know if it was worth the whole day. The man smiled at him calmly, a strange smile, like he knew something Abdi didn't yet. He told him he'd give him enough food for himself and his sick grandmother, too. Abdi was startled. He hadn't mentioned that I was sick, only that he needed food. He asked a little wary how the man knew that. The man answered calmly that small towns talk, that everybody knew about the brave boy taking care of his sick grandmother. Abdi didn't think twice. He took the job, and that's how he came to spend that whole day working in that abandoned house beside a stranger who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The work was hard, harder than Abdi had imagined going in. They hauled out old debris, swept away cobwebs hanging thick from the rafters, cleared years of dust, reorganized wood and stone scattered everywhere. Abdi worked without stopping for hours. His small hands blistered and scraped raw. His shirt got even filthier than it already was. Sweat ran down his face nonstop, but he never once complained because he knew that at the end of the day, there'd be food waiting for me. The man worked beside him in silence most of the time, but every so often he'd ask a strange question, something that didn't fit the moment but stuck with the boy anyway. While they moved a heavy beam together, he asked Abdi what he'd do if he had all the money in the world. Abdi didn't have to think long. He said he'd buy medicine and food, lots of food, so we'd never go hungry again, and after that, he'd help other people who needed it too. The man pressed a little further, asked if he wouldn't buy anything for himself, something nice, a toy, new clothes, good shoes. Abdi answered with the kind of firmness a lot of grown adults never manage, that as long as his grandmother was sick, he didn't need anything else in the world. Later, while they were clearing out a room full of old junk, the man asked him something else important. What would Abdi wish for if he could have just one wish, anything at all in the whole world? Abdi answered without hesitating that his grandmother would be healed for good. That was all he wanted, nothing else. The man looked at him with a strange intensity in his eyes, like he was seeing something beyond what human eyes usually see. He told Abdi, in that same soft, steady voice, that he was a special boy, even if he didn't know it yet. When the sun started going down, painting the sky in warm colors, the man finally told Abdi that was enough for the day, that he'd worked hard and well. Abdi straightened up, wiping his hands on his shirt, looking at the man, waiting for the food he'd been promised. The man nodded and led him around to the back of the house, where there was a small makeshift kitchen with a wood stove, and to Abdi's surprise, on a wooden table sat 2 freshly baked loaves, still warm and steaming. The man handed him both loaves, one for himself, one for his grandmother. Abdi's eyes filled with grateful tears, but the man wasn't finished yet. He handed him a small jar of what looked like golden honey, too. He explained that his grandmother needed strength to recover, that honey would help a great deal, and that he should take it without hesitation. Abdi took the jar with reverence, asked the man how he could ever pay him back for all this. The man answered with that same mysterious smile, told him he owed nothing, that he only needed to take good care of his grandmother and to always remember that God is watching acts of true love. Abdi ran home clutching the 2 loaves and the jar of honey tight against his chest, his heart racing with excitement, imagining my face when I saw all that food. But when he reached our house and pushed the door open, what he found stopped him cold. I had gotten much worse over the course of that day. My breathing had gone short and fast. My skin had taken on a sickly gray tone. My lips were cracked and dry. Abdi ran to me in a panic, dropped the bread and honey on the table, knelt by my cot crying, spoke to me with his voice shaking, showed me what he'd brought, told me there was fresh bread and golden honey, that it would do me a world of good. I opened my eyes with real effort, smiled faintly at the sight of his face, but when he tried to give me a small piece of bread, I shook my head slowly. I couldn't swallow anything anymore. Panic started rising in my grandson. He begged me to try, just a little. He touched a drop of honey to my lips. I could barely manage even that. I started coughing, a dry, painful cough that shook my whole frail body. Abdi wrapped his arms around me tight, begged me not to leave him alone, told me I had to get better, that he'd take care of me always, that Jesus had sent all that food. He said it without quite knowing why those words came out of him, just for me. I took his hand between mine, cold as ice, and with the last bit of strength I had, I spoke very quietly near his ear. I told him he was the bravest, most loving boy I'd ever known, that he should never lose that, never stop being good to others, never lose his faith in God. Abdi cried without being able to stop. He begged me not to talk that way, told me I was going to be fine soon. I stroked his cheek slowly with my thumb and promised him, barely above a breath, that even if I had to rest for a while, I'd always be watching over him from wherever I ended up. And then, right as I felt myself slipping towards something dark and quiet, right as my breathing was going shallow and my eyes were closing on their own, we both heard the door creak open behind him. Abdi told me afterward that he turned around expecting Miss Loretta or Pastor Monroe or nobody at all. Instead, the man from the abandoned house was standing in our doorway. He said the man's face carried no urgency, no alarm, just that same deep, steady calm he'd had all day, like he'd simply walked from one room of his own house into another. He walked straight to my cot without asking permission, knelt beside me and rested his hand gently on my forehead. Abdi told me later that the second that hand touched me, the whole small house went quiet in a way he couldn't explain, quieter than quiet, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I don't remember much from those last minutes myself, only pieces. A warmth spreading through my chest where there had only been cold. A voice, low and clear, saying my name the way you'd say the name of someone you'd loved a very long time. Asha, not yet. There's a boy who still needs his grandmother and a girl on her way here tonight who's going to need one too. I know now who that voice belonged to, though it would take me most of the rest of my life to say his name, the way I say it now, without hesitation. It was Jesus kneeling over me that night, though neither Abdi nor I had any language yet for saying so plainly. I didn't understand that part until later. Neither did Abdi, not until he told me the rest of what happened before he ever got home to me that evening. Here's what Abdi told me, pieced together over the years since about the hours right before he burst through our door with that bread. On his way back from the abandoned house, cutting behind it on the path toward home, he heard a small, weak sound coming from around the back wall. He found a little girl there, maybe 6 or 7, sitting against the stone foundation, filthy, hollow-cheeked with hunger, her clothes barely holding together, her bare feet cut and raw. He crouched down slow so as not to scare her, asked gently if she was all right. She just stared at him with huge, frightened brown eyes and pressed herself harder against the wall. He asked if she was hungry. She nodded, still watching him with distrust. And without thinking twice, Abdi held out one of the 2 loaves the man had just given him and told her it was hers. The girl looked at that bread like it was the most precious thing she'd ever seen, then looked at him like she was asking with her eyes whether it was really true, whether he really meant to give it to her with nothing expected back. Abdi smiled and nodded, and she took it with both small dirty hands and ate like her life depended on it, which, he realized later, it probably did. He learned her name was Amara. No mother, gone a long time back, she said. No father either. She'd been living on the street, sleeping wherever she could, eating whatever she found. Abdi felt something twist in his chest hearing that, because he knew exactly what that kind of abandonment felt like, even with a grandmother waiting for him at home. He told her, without deciding to, that his own family situation wasn't much better, that his grandmother was very sick, that in some ways they were the same. Amara looked at him and said, with the plain, unplanned wisdom kids who've suffered too much sometimes carry, that then they were equal. That's when Abdi made her an offer. He told her she could come to his house, that it wasn't much, but it was better than the street. And that's how my grandson, carrying my last hope of a proper meal in his arms, gave away the 2nd loaf without a second thought, and picked up a stray child on his way home to a dying grandmother, because that's who I'd raised him to be, whether I lived to see it or not. He brought her with him the rest of the way, and I think now, looking back, that it was that detour, that small girl he stopped for on a stone foundation, that meant Emmanuel walked through our door at exactly the moment he did, not a minute sooner, not a minute later. The man knelt there with his hand on my forehead a long moment. Abdi said Amara stood frozen in the doorway behind him, too scared to come further in. Then the man looked up at my grandson and told him gently that he already knew everything. He knew Abdi had given away his own bread to a hungry stranger, while he himself hadn't eaten in 3 days. He knew he'd worked himself to exhaustion to feed a girl he'd never met. He knew every tear Abdi had cried, every prayer he'd whispered in the dark. Abdi couldn't understand how the man knew all that. Before he could ask, the man asked him something instead. He asked if Abdi regretted giving his bread away, regretted helping that girl before thinking of himself. Abdi answered without hesitating that he didn't regret it, that he'd never regret helping somebody who needed it, because that's what I had taught him his whole life. The man smiled then, Abdi told me, a smile so warm it seemed to light up the whole small dim room. He said my grandmother taught you well, and she'd be proud of you right now. Then he turned his attention back to me. He told Abdi and Amara both to sit, that he had something to give me that no honey or bread could give. He placed both hands on me this time, one on my forehead, one over my chest, and began to pray out loud, quiet at first, then with a strength that filled every corner of that little house. Abdi said the walls themselves seemed to lean in and listen. I remember from somewhere inside whatever place I'd drifted to, feeling that warmth spread through my whole body, chasing the cold out of my hands, out of my chest, out of the fever that had been eating me alive for days. And then, Abdi told me, my eyes opened. I looked at my grandson's face first and at the terrified little girl standing behind him, and I asked in a voice that had strength in it again for the first time in weeks, who she was. Abdi laughed and cried at the same time, telling me later that this was the moment he knew, without a shadow of doubt, that something had truly happened in our house that night, because I was sitting up, breathing easy, asking questions, when an hour before I'd been slipping away in front of him. The man told us once I could sit up fully and take a little water that his name was Emmanuel, though he said it like it was one name among several people had called him over a very long time. He told Abdi and Amara that in 3 days something else was going to happen, something they'd need faith and courage to receive. Neither of them understood what he meant, not that night. He stayed only a short while longer. Before he left, he told us something I've held on to every day since. He said that when we give from our own need instead of our excess, when we feed someone while we ourselves are hungry, when we carry someone else's burden while we're too weak to carry our own, that is the kind of love that moves the heart of God in heaven. He told the story of a poor widow with only a handful of flour and a little oil, barely enough for one last meal for herself and her son, who fed a traveling prophet first anyway, trusting God with the little she had. And after that day, he told us, her flour and oil never ran out. He said it was written in an old book, 1 Kings chapter 17, and that the same God who provided for her was providing for us now, because he never changes, not yesterday, not today, not ever. Then he stood, told Abdi and Amara to take good care of me and of each other, and walked out into the dark. Abdi ran after him a few steps to ask when he'd come back, and by the time he reached the road, there was no one there at all, just the empty path, the cold air, and somewhere far off, an owl calling. 3 days later, just as Emmanuel had promised, everything changed again, though not the way any of us expected. Word had already started moving through Millbrook that I'd taken a sudden turn for the better, that a strange visitor had been seen coming and going from our house, that Abdi had a little girl living with him nobody could quite explain. On the 3rd morning, Miss Loretta came by with Pastor Monroe and Mr. Delroy, curious and a little worried, wanting to see for themselves that I really was on my feet again. They found me sitting up at our table, color back in my face, strength back in my hands, feeding Amara a bowl of oats while Abdi told anyone who'd listen about the man who'd healed his grandmother and given him bread out of thin air. Pastor Monroe listened to the whole account with tears standing in his eyes, and by that afternoon, half the town had come by to see the boy whose grandmother should have died and hadn't. I won't pretend everyone believed it right away. Some folks figured Abdi's story for a fevered kid's imagination, or a stranger's ordinary kindness dressed up bigger in a frightened boy's memory. But there was no arguing with the fact that I was alive and stronger every day, and that a hollow-cheeked little girl who'd been sleeping behind an abandoned house a week earlier was now sitting at our table like she'd always belonged there. Gerald Ashworth, the wealthiest man in that end of the county, had paid Abdi almost nothing for a full day's brutal work washing his family's laundry not long before all this happened. A single small plate of cold food for hours of labor. When he heard what people were saying about that same boy, he came around more out of suspicion than faith, expecting to catch a lie somewhere. Instead, he found Abdi giving away what little we had to anyone in town who needed it, refusing to keep anything back for himself, and something in Gerald's hard, guarded heart came loose. He knelt right there in our little yard, an old man before an 11-year-old boy, and asked forgiveness for how he'd treated him. Abdi forgave him without a second's hesitation, the way I'd taught him to, and told him God would forgive him too if he meant it. Gerald meant it. In the years after, he gave away most of what he owned, funded a proper shelter at the edge of town, and until the day he died, he told anyone who'd listen that he'd found God through a poor, hungry boy who had nothing left to give and gave it anyway. Abdi's parents came for him not long after, once the story reached them down in Boston, and shame and love both drove them back north at once. There were hard, honest tears exchanged in that reunion, plenty of asking for forgiveness on their end, and plenty of it given freely on ours. My son Omar held his boy so long that first evening I thought neither of them would ever let go, and Zainab sat beside me on my cot, the way she used to as a young bride, holding my hand and apologizing for every month of silence in a voice that kept breaking. Abdi told them plainly he wouldn't come without Amara, that she was his sister now in every way that mattered, and that was that. They took her in without a second thought. I stayed behind in Millbrook a while longer before eventually following them down to be closer to my grandchildren, both of them, because that's what she became to me too, and no one in our family ever called her anything but that again. Abdi grew up, went on to study social work, spent his adult life doing exactly what that mysterious man's kindness had planted in him at 11 years old, showing up for people the world had stopped looking for. He still talks about Jesus the way most people talk about the person who saved their life, plainly, gratefully, without embarrassment, whether the room is comfortable with it or not. Amara became a nurse, the way she always said she would from the time she was old enough to remember wanting anything at all. Between the two of them, they built something real out of what started as one boy's bread given away twice in a single day. Now I need to tell you what took me the longest to arrive at, because it's the part of this story that's mine alone to carry, not my grandson's. I was raised the way my mother raised me and her mother raised her, to honor Isa as a mighty prophet of God, born of Mary, sent to guide and to heal, one of the greatest of all the messengers, and I believed that without a single doubt for over 50 years of my life, straight through the night, a stranger knelt beside my deathbed with his hand on my forehead, and my fever broke under his palm like ice under a fire. But a prophet carries somebody else's message forward. What knelt beside me that night did not feel like a man reporting on a greater mercy he'd witnessed elsewhere. It felt like the mercy itself, kneeling there, with my name already known to him before anyone in that room had said it out loud. He knew my grandson's whole heart before Abdi ever opened his mouth to explain it. When he said my name and told me it wasn't my time yet, I wasn't hearing a messenger relay somebody else's decision. I was hearing the one making it. It took me years to say that out loud, all the way I'm saying it to you now. I kept my prayers the way I'd always kept them for a long while after that night, honoring the God of my mother and my mother's mother, honoring Isa exactly as I'd been raised to. I never stopped loving the faith that raised me, and I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters to anyone listening who's walking anything close to the road I walked. But I also kept going back, quietly, to Pastor Monroe's little church at the edge of town. At first, just to sit in the back and think, and then, over years, to actually listen, and eventually to ask him the hard questions I'd been circling since that night without letting myself land on them. He never once rushed me, let every question come at whatever pace it wanted to come. And somewhere in all those slow years, I understood I had already believed since the second that warmth spread back through my chest, and I heard my own name spoken like it mattered to the one saying it. I'd simply needed a long time to stop being afraid of what, admitting that, fully, was going to cost an old woman whose whole life, whose whole family, had been built inside one faith since before she could walk. It cost me some things. A cousin back home who'd prayed beside me my whole childhood told me, with real grief in her voice, that she couldn't walk where I was walking, and we still don't speak the way we used to. That one aches on quiet nights more than I let most people see. But I was raised believing Isa enters exactly where nobody else is willing to go. And in the end, that is precisely the door I walked through, all the way, at an age when most people think a life is already fully decided. On a Sunday morning, a few years after that night in Millbrook, in a plain white dress, my hands shaking the same way they'd shaken 30 years earlier over a piece of bread I couldn't manage to swallow, I stood in the water at Pastor Monroe's church. Abdi stood at the edge of the water, a grown man by then, and Amara stood beside him. And between the two of them, they'd filled every empty seat in that little sanctuary with the family none of us had expected to end up with. Pastor Monroe asked me, in front of that gathering, whether I believed Jesus Christ was Lord, not only a prophet, but the Son of the living God, my Savior. I told him I did, and my voice held steady, the way it hadn't held steady over much of anything in a very long time. I told him Isa is Lord, not only a messenger, Lord over the whole of my life, the way he was Lord the night he knelt over a dying old woman in a rattling little house, and decided out loud that it wasn't her time yet. They lowered me into the water, and I came up gasping, laughing, and weeping together, and I understood finally all the way through what that whole terrible Holy Week had actually been building toward. He hadn't only come to heal my body that night. He'd come to heal something in me that would take 30 more years to fully let go of its fear, and he was patient enough to wait for every single one of them. I'm 61 now. My hands still shake sometimes, old age doing what old age does, but I still sew when my grandchildren bring me torn things to mend, because some habits outlast even miracles. Abdi visits every week with his own children now, and Amara calls me every Sunday evening without fail, same as she has since she was a hollow-cheeked 7-year-old, sitting behind an abandoned house with nowhere else to go. If you take one thing from my life, let it be this. I once thought I understood exactly how much I had to give, and exactly how little was left when it ran out. I was wrong on both counts. My grandson gave away bread twice in a single day while he himself was starving, and by the time the sun came up, there was more than either of us knew what to do with. Whatever you think you don't have enough of tonight, whatever's making you tired down to the bone, hand it over anyway. Jesus doesn't wait for your cup to be full before he uses what's in it. Call on him. He already knew my name before I ever had the strength left to say his. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen.